Get out of the way or you're next. The man's voice didn't shake, even though his hands were empty, and his stomach was hollow from 3 days without food. Three strangers had surrounded a terrified young woman on a dead highway outside Phoenix, and the only person willing to step between her and them was a homeless man nobody in this city had ever bothered to look at twice. He had no weapon, no home, no name they cared to learn. But in the next 60 seconds, that forgotten man would risk everything he had left to save the daughter of one of the most feared bikers in Arizona. Before we go back to where it all began, if stories about real courage and second chances mean something to you, hit subscribe and join our storytelling family tonight. And in the comments, tell us what city you are watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled by the time it ends. Now let's go back to the beginning. Daniel Carter used to be somebody. Not famous, not rich, just somebody who mattered to the people around him. He had spent 11 years with grease under his fingernails and a wrench in his back pocket, working in a garage on the east side of Phoenix where men brought in engines that other mechanics had already given up on. Daniel didn't give up on things. That was who he was. Give him a dead engine in 20 minutes and he could tell you exactly what killed it just by listening. "You've got ears like a doctor," his boss used to tell him, laughing, slapping him on the shoulder. "Except doctors charge $400 and you charge $40. Daniel would just smile and keep working. He liked being useful. He liked knowing that when somebody's car broke down on the side of the road with kids in the back seat, he was the guy who could fix it and get that family home safe by dinner. Then his mother got sick. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away. Fatigue she blamed on her job. By the time the doctors found the tumor, it had already spread too far to stop. "We're going to do everything we can," the oncologist told them, and Daniel believed him because Daniel still believed the world worked the way it was supposed to. It didn't. The treatments ate through Daniel's savings in 4 months. Then they ate through his mother's small pension. Then they ate through the equity in the tiny house she'd spent 30 years paying off. Daniel worked double shifts at the garage and picked up side jobs on weekends, fixing his neighbors' cars for cash, anything to keep the medical bills from crushing them both. "You should be living your life, not spending it in waiting rooms," his mother told him one night, her voice thin, her hand cold in his. "This is my life," Daniel said, "taking care of you. There's nowhere else I'd rather be." She died on a Tuesday morning in March. Daniel was holding her hand when it happened. He remembered the exact moment her fingers went slack. The exact sound the heart monitor made when it flattened into a single unbroken tone. He didn't cry in the hospital. He waited until he got home, sat down on the floor of the house they'd shared his whole life, and cried until his throat gave out. 6 weeks later, the garage where he'd worked for 11 years shut its doors. The owner was retiring, the building was being sold to a developer, and there was no severance, no warning beyond a handwritten sign taped to the front window. "I'm sorry, Daniel," the owner told him. And Daniel could see he meant it. "You're the best mechanic I ever had, but I can't help you right now. I can barely help myself." Daniel understood. He always understood. That was the problem. Understanding didn't pay the mortgage his mother's medical bills had already devoured. Within 4 months, the bank took the house. Within 6, his savings were gone. Within 8, his friends stopped returning his calls the way people sometimes do when someone else's bad luck starts to feel contagious. By the time winter came, Daniel Carter was sleeping under a concrete overpass on the outskirts of Phoenix with everything he owned zipped inside a backpack that used to belong to his mother. People walked past him every single day. Some looked away like he was something ugly they didn't want to see. Some tossed $1 in his direction without ever meeting his eyes, as if eye contact might make him human, and making him human might make his pain their responsibility. A few muttered things under their breath. "Get a job, boom." Probably a druggie, waste of space, never once asking what had actually happened. Never once wondering if the man they were stepping around used to save families' cars for free when they couldn't afford the fix. Nobody wondered who Daniel used to be. Nobody asked what he still could be. But there was one thing Phoenix never managed to strip out of him, no matter how cold the nights got or how empty his stomach stayed. Daniel Carter never lost the instinct to help someone in trouble. It lived in him the way his mother's voice still lived in him, the way the sound of a dying engine still made his ears prick up out of pure muscle memory. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, his mother used to say, but by what they choose to do when nobody's watching. Daniel had heard her say it 100 times growing up, usually after he'd given away his lunch money to some kid at school who didn't have any, or spent his Saturday helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries instead of hanging out with friends. He hadn't understood back then why it mattered so much to her. He understood now. It was the only thing he had left that nobody could take. On a night in late October with the desert air finally cooling after another brutal Arizona summer, Daniel walked the frontage road near an empty stretch of highway outside the city the way he did most nights when sleep wouldn't come. The walking helped. It gave his mind something to focus on besides hunger. Besides the ache in his knees, besides the quiet, constant hum of shame that never fully went away, no matter how many times he told himself none of this was his fault. He heard it before he understood what he was hearing. A motorcycle engine, strong, healthy, running clean, and then abruptly wrong. A stutter, a cough, a dying rattle that cut off into silence. Daniel stopped walking. Every hair on his arms rose. Because somewhere underneath the hunger, underneath 8 months of sleeping outside, underneath the invisible man Phoenix had turned him into, the mechanic in him was still alive. That sound and engine failing hit something ancient and automatic inside him. He turned toward it. He didn't have to think about the decision. His feet were already moving. The road was darker than usual, streetlights broken, or simply not reaching this far from the city center. As Daniel got closer, he saw a shape at the edge of the shoulder. A motorcycle tipped slightly, its rider standing beside it with her hands pressed against her helmet in frustration. She pulled the helmet off, and Daniel saw her clearly for the first time. A young woman, blonde hair pulled back in a braid that had come half loose, maybe early 20s, wearing a leather jacket that looked expensive, but practical, the kind bikers wore who actually rode instead of just looking the part. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was pulling her phone from her jacket pocket, tapping the screen, her frustration deepening. No signal, she muttered to herself. Are you kidding me right now? Daniel slowed his approach, not wanting to startle her. A woman alone on an empty road at night didn't need a stranger appearing out of the darkness without warning. Ma'am, he called out, keeping his voice low and even. You all right? I heard your bike cut out. She spun toward him, fast her body tensing, one hand instinctively going toward her jacket. And Daniel understood immediately what she saw. A man in torn, dirty clothes, no shoes that matched. A backpack slung over one shoulder that had clearly seen better decades. He knew exactly what he looked like to a stranger on a dark road at night, and he stopped walking, keeping distance between them, holding both hands slightly out from his sides. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quickly. I used to be a mechanic. I heard your engine die from up the road. Thought maybe I could help. The young woman studied him for a long moment, her guard still up, but her fear easing slightly. It just died, she said. 1 second it was running fine, next second it just stopped. I've never had this happen before. Mind if I take a look? She hesitated. Daniel didn't blame her. But something in her eyes shifted, maybe desperation, maybe instinct, maybe the simple fact that she was stranded on an empty road with no signal and no other option in sight. Yeah, she said finally. Yeah, okay, please. Her name, Daniel would learn only minutes later, was Emily Hayes, 22 years old. And the motorcycle she was standing beside wasn't just any bike. It belonged to a world Daniel hadn't set foot in for a very long time, a world where machines were treated like family, and the people who rode them treated each other the same way. Daniel knelt beside the bike, running his hands along the fuel line out of pure instinct, listening the way he always had, letting his fingers do the diagnosing. His eyes couldn't finish in the dark. Could be your fuel line, he said. Could be electrical. I'd need better light to know for sure. Great, Emily muttered, only half joking. Perfect end to a perfect night. That was the exact moment headlights swept across the road behind them. Daniel felt it before he understood it. The same instinct that had once told him an engine was 2 months from failure told him now that something was wrong. The car slowed, then it stopped. Then 3 men got out, unhurried, the way men only walk when they believe they have all the time in the world and nothing to fear. Emily straightened immediately, her body going rigid. Car trouble? The first man called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. We're fine, Emily said quickly, stepping slightly closer to Daniel without seeming to realize she'd done it. Just waiting on a friend. The second man laughed low and unpleasant. Out here, nobody's coming out here, sweetheart. Daniel felt his pulse pick up. He'd survived 8 months on the street. He knew the difference between men who were curious and men who were hunting. These men were hunting. We're good. Daniel said, stepping half in front of Emily without making it obvious that's what he was doing. Appreciate the concern. The third man, the leader Daniel could tell by the way the other two deferred to him without a word, looked Daniel up and down slowly and then laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a cruel one. This your boyfriend? He asked Emily, jerking his chin toward Daniel. This is who's protecting you out here. Walk away, the leader said to Daniel, his tone shifting instantly from mockery to command. This doesn't concern you. Daniel didn't move. Yes, she needs help with her bike, Daniel said evenly. I'm helping her. That's all this is. The leader's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, close enough that Daniel could smell alcohol on his breath, close enough to see the tattoo crawling up the side of his neck. I'm going to say this once, the man said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. Walk away. Daniel's heart was slamming against his ribs. Every survival instinct he had, every instinct that had kept him alive through 8 brutal months of sleeping outside, in a city that mostly wanted him gone, screamed at him to do exactly what the man said. Walk away, save himself. He owed this stranger nothing. But then he looked at Emily's face. He saw the fear behind her eyes, the way her hands were trembling. Even as she tried to hold herself steady, the way she'd unconsciously moved half a step behind him, like he was the only solid thing left on this empty road. And his mother's voice rose up inside him, clear as the night she'd first said it to him as a boy. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, but by what they choose to do when nobody is watching. Nobody was watching. Nobody would ever know if Daniel Carter turned and walked into the darkness and let whatever happened next happen without him. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. No, he said quietly. The leader blinked like he hadn't expected the word. What did you say to me? I said no. Daniel repeated, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm not walking away from her. For a moment, nobody moved. The desert around them was completely silent, the kind of silence that exists only in the seconds right before something breaks. Then the leader smiled, and it was the coldest thing Daniel had seen in a long time. Bold words, the man said, for a guy who doesn't even have shoes that match. The second man laughed again, and this time it echoed off the empty road. You think you're going to stop us? The leader continued, stepping even closer, close enough now that Daniel could see every hard line in his face. Look at you. You're nothing. Nobody's going to miss you if this goes bad. Daniel felt the words land exactly where they were meant to, in the deepest, rawest part of him, the part that had spent 8 months being told the same thing by a city that stepped over him every single day. Nobody's going to miss you. He'd heard some version of that sentence 100 times since he lost everything. But hearing it from a stranger threatening a woman he'd known for 4 minutes was different. It didn't shrink him the way it usually did. It made something in him harden. Maybe not, Daniel said, but she's not going to be alone out here while you 3 decide what you're going to do to her. So you're going to have to go through me first. The leader's jaw tightened. Wrong answer, he said. And then everything happened fast. The second man lunged first, grabbing Daniel's arm and yanking him sideways with a force that sent him stumbling into the dirt shoulder of the road. Daniel hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his shoulder, but he was already scrambling back up, positioning his body between the men and Emily. Run, Daniel gasped toward her. Get to the road, flag down a car. I'm not leaving you, Emily started. Run! The third man, the leader, grabbed a fistful of Daniel's shirt and threw a punch that connected with his jaw, snapping his head sideways, stars exploding across his vision. Daniel tasted blood immediately, copper and sharp. He didn't have fighting experience. He'd never been in a real fight in his life. What he had was 8 months of hunger, exhaustion, and a body that had been slowly breaking down from sleeping on concrete, and against 3 grown men who clearly knew how to hurt people, none of that was enough. But he stayed on his feet. The second punch came from the man he hadn't been watching, catching him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs in a single violent gasp. Daniel doubled over, and a knee came up to meet his face. He went down. Through the ringing in his ears, through the blood in his mouth, Daniel heard Emily scream his name. Not hey or stranger, but a fragment of his name, because somewhere in the last 5 minutes he must have told her, though he couldn't remember doing it. Daniel. He forced himself back up onto his hands and knees. Run, he choked out, again spitting blood onto the asphalt. Emily, please run. For a moment, she didn't move. Daniel could see the war happening behind her eyes, the instinct to help fighting against the terror of what would happen if she didn't leave. Go, Daniel roared, finding strength from somewhere he didn't know he still had, hauling himself upright and putting his body fully between her and the three men one more time. I've got this. Go. Now, something in his voice must have finally broken through because Emily turned and ran. The leader started after her, but Daniel grabbed his arm using every last ounce of strength left in his exhausted, starving body to hold him back. You want her, Daniel said through gritted teeth, blood dripping from his split lip. You go through me. The leader turned back to him with an expression Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, but something colder. Contempt. The look of a man who had decided Daniel wasn't worth the effort of mercy. Fine, the man said. Have it your way. That was when Daniel saw the glint of metal, a blade small but real, catching what little light the moon offered. Daniel's entire body went cold. He'd known this could turn violent. He hadn't let himself think about how violent. Whoa, wait, Daniel said, backing up half a step, his hands rising instinctively. Should have walked away, the leader said and lunged. Daniel twisted, barely avoiding the blade, feeling it graze across his forearm in a hot line of pain. He cried out, stumbling backward, his vision swimming from blood loss and exhaustion and adrenaline, all crashing together at once. Somewhere in the distance, headlights swept across the road. Emily had reached the highway. She was waving her arms frantically at an oncoming truck, screaming for help. The leader saw the lights too. He froze, calculating, and Daniel understood in that fraction of a second that the man was deciding whether pursuing this any further was worth the risk of witnesses. Let's go, the second man said urgently, already backing toward their car. Someone's stopping. Let's go. The leader stared at Daniel one more moment, blood dripping from Daniel's arm onto the dirt between them, and then spat at his feet. You're gonna regret this, he said. Then the three of them were gone, tires screeching against asphalt, taillights shrinking into the darkness. Daniel stood alone on the empty road, swaying his shoulders, screaming, his ribs on fire, blood running warm down his arm and dripping steadily onto the pavement. He took one step toward the highway, toward the truck that had stopped, toward Emily's voice calling his name in the distance. And then his legs simply stopped working. The last thing Daniel Carter remembered before the world went black was the sound of Emily's voice getting closer, frantic, terrified, and the strange, quiet peace of knowing that whatever happened to him now, she was safe. He woke up to fluorescent light and the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. For a long moment, Daniel didn't know where he was. The last 8 months had trained his body to wake up disoriented under bridges, in doorways, in places where waking up disoriented could get you robbed or worse. His muscles tensed on instinct before his mind even caught up. Then he saw the IV in his arm, the white sheets, the soft hum of hospital machinery. A hospital, he realized. I'm in a hospital. He hadn't been inside a hospital since the night his mother died. His whole body ached in a dozen different places. His jaw, where the first punch landed his ribs, where the second one hit the long stinging line across his forearm that had been cleaned and stitched. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a wave of dizziness rolling through him. Easy, a voice said. You lost some blood, don't push it. A nurse stood near the door checking something on a chart. She approached his bedside, her expression carefully neutral, in the way medical professionals were trained to be. But Daniel had spent enough time being judged by strangers to recognize the flicker of assessment in her eyes as she took in his condition, his clothes, the state he'd clearly arrived in. You're lucky, she said. The cut on your arm was deep, but it missed anything vital. Couple cracked ribs. You're going to be sore for a while. The woman, Daniel said immediately, his voice raw. Emily, is she? She's fine, the nurse said. She's the one who called it in. She's been in the waiting room for the last 2 hours asking about you every 20 minutes. Relief hit Daniel so hard it nearly brought tears to his eyes. She was safe. Whatever happened to him now, whatever came next, she was safe. That was when he heard raised voices outside the door. Not angry exactly, but urgent. Tense in a way that made every muscle in Daniel's body tighten instinctively. A police officer stepped into view. First notepad in hand, his eyes settling on Daniel with an expression Daniel recognized immediately, an expression he'd seen 100 times over the last 8 months. Suspicion. You're the one who was with the victim, the officer said. It wasn't quite a question. I was trying to help her, Daniel said carefully. 3 men attacked us. We've got a witness statement saying there was a physical altercation. The officer continued, cutting him off, his tone flat and procedural. Can you tell me your name? Do you have identification? Daniel's stomach dropped. He didn't have identification, not anymore. His wallet, his ID, everything had been lost or stolen months ago living on the street. He knew exactly how this looked. A homeless man, no ID, found bleeding at the scene of a violent incident. My name is Daniel Carter, he said. I lost my ID a while back. I've been living. He stopped, swallowed. I've been homeless for about 8 months. He watched the officer's expression shift, harden slightly, and Daniel felt something painfully familiar settle over him. He'd risked his life for a stranger less than 3 hours ago, and now he was about to be treated like the criminal instead of the man who'd bled trying to protect her. Sir, I need you to stay right here while we sort out exactly what happened, the officer said, and though his tone stayed professional, Daniel heard the undertone clearly enough. We need to figure out whether you're the victim or the suspect. Before Daniel could respond, another voice cut through the room, sharp, and furious. Are you seriously questioning him right now? Emily pushed past the officer, her eyes red from crying, her jaw set with an anger that surprised Daniel given how gentle she'd seemed on the road. This man, Emily said, pointing directly at Daniel, her voice shaking with intensity, put himself between me and 3 armed men. He told me to run while they were literally attacking him. He has nothing to do with what happened to me. He's the reason nothing worse happened. The officer held up Ma'am, we just need to establish the full picture. The full picture, Emily snapped, is that a stranger with no shoes that match saw 3 men surrounding me on an empty road and decided my life mattered more than his own safety. That's the full picture. Write that down. The room fell silent. Daniel stared at her, stunned, something tightening painfully in his throat. Nobody had defended him like that in longer than he could remember. The officer, to his credit, softened slightly, jotting something down before nodding toward Daniel. We'll need a full statement from both of you, he said more gently now. But given what Ms. Hayes has described, I don't think we're looking at you as a suspect, Mr. Carter. I apologize for the assumption. Daniel nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. The officer stepped out to coordinate with his partner, leaving Emily standing beside Daniel's bed, her arms wrapped around herself, some of her fury draining into exhaustion now that the immediate threat had passed. You didn't have to do that, Daniel said quietly. Neither did you, Emily said, but you did it anyway. She pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down, studying him for a long moment. Why? She asked finally. You didn't know me. You could have just kept walking. Nobody would have blamed you. Daniel thought about the answer for a moment, thought about his mother, about 11 years of fixing things other people had given up on, about 8 months of being invisible to a city that had decided he no longer mattered. Because somebody needed help, he said simply, and I was the person who was there. Emily's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she didn't try to hide them. My dad's on his way, she said. I called him from the waiting room. Something in her voice made Daniel look at her more closely. Your dad. He's going to want to meet you, Emily said. He's going to want to know exactly who saved his daughter's life tonight. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the man walking through those hospital doors within the hour wasn't just any father. Marcus Hayes was known across half of Arizona by a name that made grown men go quiet in bars and back away in parking lots. To the world, they called him Iron Wolf, president of the local Hells Angels chapter, a man whose loyalty ran as deep as his temper. And in less than 30 minutes, Marcus Hayes would walk through that hospital door expecting to hear about an attack on his daughter. He would not expect to hear about the stranger who'd bled on an empty highway to make sure she came home. The doors of the emergency room hissed open, and even from his bed, Daniel felt the shift in the air before he saw the man walk through. Marcus Hayes moved like someone who had never once in his life had to ask permission to enter a room. Broad shoulders, a leather cut covered in patches Daniel didn't recognize, but instinctively understood the weight of. A silver beard, a scar above one eyebrow, and eyes that swept the hallway with the focused intensity of a man scanning for threats before he'd even fully processed the situation in front of him. Emily. The moment he saw his daughter, something in his posture shifted, the hard edges softening for just a fraction of a second as he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. Dad, I'm okay, Emily said quickly, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I'm okay, I promise. Marcus pulled back his hands on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injuries with barely restrained panic beneath the controlled exterior. What happened? He demanded. Emily, tell me exactly what happened. My bike died on the highway, she said. 3 men pulled up. They were dead. They were going to hurt me. And then she turned, gesturing toward Daniel's bed, and Marcus's gaze followed hers for the first time, landing on the bruised, bandaged stranger lying in the hospital bed. Daniel watched Marcus's expression, carefully bracing himself. He knew exactly what he looked like: homeless, beaten, a stranger. His daughter had somehow ended up alone with on an empty road at night. Daniel had seen enough of the world over the last 8 months to know how quickly assumptions could turn dangerous, especially with a man whose reputation carried the weight Marcus Hayes clearly did. He didn't even know my name, Emily said, her voice cracking with emotion. He just saw someone in trouble on the side of the road and he stepped in. He fought 3 of them, Dad, alone. He told me to run while they were still hitting him. Marcus went very still. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on Daniel with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. Not the anger he'd braced for, not suspicion, but something heavier. Something that looked almost like disbelief. You're telling me, Marcus said slowly, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have, that a complete stranger put himself between you and 3 armed men and almost got himself killed doing it. Yes, Emily said. Marcus turned back to Daniel, and Daniel forced himself to meet the older man's gaze despite every instinct, screaming at him to look away, to make himself smaller, the way he'd trained himself to do over 8 months of being an unwelcome presence in every space he occupied. Is that true? Marcus asked him directly. I just did what anyone should have done, Daniel said quietly. Something flickered behind Marcus Hayes' eyes. No, Marcus said, his voice quiet now, almost rough. Most people say that. Most people tell themselves that's what they do right up until the moment it actually matters, and then they don't. They walk the other way. They tell themselves it's not their business. They let it happen to somebody else's daughter, so it doesn't have to happen to them. He took a step closer to the bed, his massive frame casting a shadow over Daniel that should have felt threatening and somehow didn't. You didn't walk away, buddy, Marcus said. You bled on that road instead. Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Marcus's eyes moved over him, then really looked at him the way almost nobody had looked at Daniel in 8 months. Not with disgust, not with pity, with something that looked almost like respect, and it hit Daniel harder than any of the punches he'd taken that night. What's your name, son? Daniel, he said. Daniel Carter. Marcus nodded slowly, like he was committing the name to memory in a way that mattered, in a way that meant something. Daniel Carter, he repeated. You saved my daughter's life tonight. I just... Don't, Marcus said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Don't shrink it. Don't make it smaller than it was. My daughter is standing here right now, safe, breathing, whole, because you decided her life mattered more than your own safety. That's not nothing. Don't you dare tell me that's nothing. Daniel felt his throat tighten, painfully, felt something hot pressing behind his eyes that he refused to let fall in front of these strangers. For 8 months, he had been invisible. He had watched thousands of people walk past him without a single flicker of acknowledgement that he existed at all, let alone that he had once been someone who fixed things, someone who mattered, someone whose mother had been proud of the man he'd become before the world quietly erased him. And now this man, this stranger with a reputation that made other men nervous, was sitting beside his hospital bed looking at him like he was still that person. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. I don't know how I'll ever repay what you did tonight. But I promise you this, I'm not walking out of this hospital and forgetting your name. Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment, exhaustion and pain, and something that felt dangerously close to hope all crashing over him at once. He didn't know it yet, couldn't have known it lying there bruised and bleeding under fluorescent hospital lights. But the life he'd lost 8 months ago, the life he'd stopped believing he'd ever get back, had just quietly, unexpectedly begun to turn. Marcus pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down the way a man sits when he intends to stay a while. Tell me about yourself, Daniel, he said. Tell me who you were before tonight. And for the first time in 8 months, someone actually wanted to know. Marcus Hayes settled deeper into the chair beside Danielle's bed, and for a long moment he simply watched him the way a man studies something he doesn't yet understand, but knows is important. Start from the beginning, Marcus said. I want to hear all of it. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to anyone asking. For 8 months, the only questions strangers ever asked him were the ones that came with judgment, already baked into the tone. Why don't you get a job? Why don't you clean yourself up? Why are you really out here? Nobody asked because they wanted to understand. They asked because they wanted their assumptions confirmed. But Marcus wasn't looking at him that way. His eyes were steady, patient waiting. I was a mechanic, Daniel said finally. 11 years at the same garage. My mother got sick a couple years back. Cancer. I spent everything I had trying to save her, every dollar, every shift I could pick up. Lost the house paying for treatments that didn't work in the end. His voice caught slightly, and he pushed through it. She passed in March. Garage closed 6 weeks later. The owner retired, sold the building. No severance, no warning. By the time I understood how much trouble I was actually in, I'd already missed too many payments to catch up. Bank took what was left of the house in the spring. I've been on the street since. Marcus didn't interrupt once. He let the silence stretch after Daniel finished, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than before. 11 years at one shop, he said. That's not nothing. That's loyalty most men don't have anymore. Didn't matter in the end, Daniel said quietly. Loyalty doesn't pay medical bills. No, Marcus agreed, but it tells me something about the kind of man you are. And tonight told me the rest. Emily, still seated near the foot of the bed, wiped at her eyes again and cleared her throat. Dad, he needs to rest. He lost a lot of blood. Marcus nodded slowly, but before he could respond, the door opened and a doctor stepped in, glancing between the three of them with the brisk efficiency of someone with 6 other patients waiting. Mr. Carter, good you're awake, the doctor said, flipping through a chart. Your labs came back stable. The stitches in your arm should hold. Fine ribs are bruised but not fractured. You're going to be sore for a couple weeks, but you'll heal. Thank you, Daniel said. I do need to go over discharge information with you, the doctor continued, and Daniel felt his stomach tighten, already sensing what was coming. Normally we'd send you home with instructions to rest ice the ribs, keep the stitches dry. Is there someone who can help you get settled tonight? Family, a partner? No, Daniel said quietly. There's nobody. The doctor paused, glancing down at his chart again, and Daniel watched the exact moment the man clocked the intake notes. Patient reports, no fixed address. I see, the doctor said, his tone shifting into something careful. In that case, I can have our social worker come speak with you about shelter placement before you're discharged. There are a few options in the city that... He's not going to a shelter. Marcus's voice cut through the room like a blade, quiet but absolute. The doctor looked up, startled by the interruption. I'm sorry. I said he's not going to a shelter, Marcus repeated, standing now, his full frame filling the small room. This man nearly died protecting my daughter tonight. He's not walking out of this hospital with nowhere to go. The doctor glanced between Marcus and Daniel, clearly unsure how to navigate the sudden shift in the room's temperature. I understand the sentiment, sir, but I can only discharge him according to hospital protocol and... Then find whatever protocol lets him leave with me, Marcus said. I'll sign whatever needs signing. Daniel felt something clench painfully in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the raw, disorienting sensation of watching a stranger fight for him the way nobody had fought for him in months. Marcus, you don't have to, Daniel started. I know I don't have to, Marcus said, turning back toward him, his expression softening slightly. I want to. There's a difference. The doctor cleared his throat, clearly deciding this was a battle not worth having. I'll have the discharge paperwork ready within the hour. Mr. Carter, keep the wound clean, change the dressing daily, and follow up with a primary care physician if you have one arranged. He left the room, and the moment the door clicked shut, Emily let out a small, disbelieving laugh. You really weren't going to let him know, were you? She said to her father. Wasn't planning on it, Marcus said. Daniel shook his head slowly, overwhelmed, unsure how to hold all of it. The exhaustion, the pain in his ribs, the strange, dizzying relief of being fought for instead of dismissed. I don't understand why you're doing this. You don't know me. Marcus sat back down, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. I know everything I need to know, he said. I know you heard a stranger's engine die on an empty road at night, and you walked toward the danger instead of away from it. I know 3 grown men told you to leave, and you told them no. I know you bled out on that asphalt so my little girl could get to a phone. He paused, his jaw tightening. You think I'm going to let a man like that sleep under a bridge tonight after what you did for my family? Before Daniel could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed against his thigh. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen and his expression shifted instantly. The warmth still present, but now layered with something harder, more focused. "It's Tank," he said, standing. "I need to take this." He stepped just outside the door, but the walls of the hospital room were thin enough that Daniel caught fragments of the conversation anyway. Yeah, she's fine. No, I need you to run plates, whatever the responding officer got off the vehicle. I don't care if it's late. I want names by morning. Emily met Daniel's eyes and offered a small, tired smile. "That's Tank, Dad's sergeant at arms. If those men left any kind of trail, he'll find it." "Sergeant at arms," Daniel repeated slowly. "Your father's the president of the Hells Angels chapter." "You didn't know?" "I had a guess," Daniel admitted. "Didn't seem like the moment to ask." Emily laughed softly despite everything, and for a brief second, some of the exhaustion in her face lifted. "Most people know the second they meet him. You just met him bleeding out on a hospital bed, so I guess the usual first impression didn't really apply." Marcus stepped back into the room a few minutes later. His phone already pocketed, his expression grim, in a way that made both Emily and Daniel straighten in their seats. "What is it?" Emily asked immediately. "Tank got a partial plate off a traffic camera near the highway," Marcus said. "Registered to a guy named Victor Reyes. Priors for assault possession with intent, one aggravated robbery charge that got pled down. He's not some random opportunist. This is a guy with a record." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You think he'll come back?" "I think men like that don't like being humiliated," Marcus said. "And I think you humiliated him tonight. 3 of them, one of you, and you still cost him his prize." "His prize?" Emily said, her voice tightening with fresh anger. "I'm not a prize." "No," Marcus agreed quietly. "You're not. But that's how a man like Reyes sees it, and that's what worries me." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the statement settling over all 3 of them. "What do we do?" Emily asked. "We find him before he finds either of you," Marcus said simply. "That's what we do." By the time Daniel was discharged, the sun had already begun climbing over the desert horizon, casting pale light through the hospital's front windows. His whole body ached with every step, his ribs screaming in protest as he moved, but he refused the wheelchair. The nurse offered some stubborn remnant of pride, insisting he walk out on his own 2 feet. Marcus was waiting by the entrance engine, already running on a black pickup truck parked at the curb, Emily in the passenger seat with dark circles under her eyes from a night without sleep. "Get in," Marcus said, opening the back door for Daniel. "You're staying with me tonight. Non-negotiable." Daniel climbed in, slowly wincing, and for a moment just sat there staring at his own hands still faintly stained with old grease. He hadn't been able to fully scrub away, even after 8 months without real work. Hands that had almost died, holding off 3 armed strangers for a woman he hadn't even known existed 12 hours earlier. "You all right back there?" Marcus asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Yeah," Daniel said. It's a lot, all of this. 12 hours ago, I was sleeping under a bridge, and now I'm..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Now you're somewhere safe," Marcus finished for him. "That's all this is. Somewhere safe. Nothing complicated about it." But it was complicated, Daniel thought. Watching the city blur past the window, it was the most complicated thing that had happened to him in 8 months, because for the first time since his mother died, someone was treating him like he mattered, and some deeply wounded part of him didn't know how to trust that it was real. Marcus's house sat on the edge of the city, modest compared to what Daniel had expected from a man with his reputation, a single-story ranch house with a wide garage attached to the side, motorcycles visible through the open bay door, tools organized along the walls with a precision that told Daniel everything he needed to know about the kind of man who owned them. "Guest rooms down the hall," Marcus said, leading Daniel inside. "Bathrooms attached. There's clothes in the closet that should fit you close enough. My nephew stays here sometimes, left half his wardrobe behind." Daniel stood in the doorway of the guest room, staring at the bed, an actual bed with actual sheets, in an actual room with an actual door that locked, and felt something in his chest crack open in a way he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how to..." Don't," Marcus said gently but firmly, the same way he'd cut Daniel off in the hospital. "You don't owe me thanks. If anything runs the other direction." He left Daniel alone, and Daniel sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before finally lying down, and for the first time in 8 months, he slept without one eye open, without his body braced for someone to steal what little he had, or worse. He woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of voices in another part of the house. Daniel dressed carefully, wincing at the pull in his ribs, and followed the voices toward the kitchen, where he found Marcus sitting across from a heavy-set man with a graying beard and forearms covered in faded tattoos, the same voice Daniel recognized from the phone call at the hospital. "Daniel," Marcus said, standing. "This is Tank, my sergeant-at-arms." Tank looked Daniel over slowly, the assessment lasting several seconds too long to be casual. "So you're the one," Tank said finally. "I guess I am," Daniel said, unsure what response was expected. Tank's expression didn't soften. "You understand what you did, right? You crossed Victor Reyes. Guy's got friends, not the kind of friends who let things go." "Tank," Marcus said, a note of warning in his voice. "I'm just saying it plain, Marcus," Tank continued undeterred. "This isn't some random street thug we're talking about. Reyes runs with a crew that's been tied to at least 2 unsolved cases in the last year. We bring a stranger into the clubhouse, into your home, and we don't even know if he's going to paint a target on your back just by being here." Daniel felt his face flush, old instincts rising the reflex to apologize, to shrink, to make himself smaller before someone decided he wasn't worth the trouble. "I didn't ask to be brought anywhere," Daniel said quietly, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. "I heard an engine die on an empty road and I went to help. I didn't know who Emily was. I didn't know who any of you were. I just saw someone in danger." Tank studied him for a long moment, something in his hard expression flickering slightly. "That true?" Tank asked Marcus. "Emily confirmed it," Marcus said. "He had no idea who she was, no idea what he was walking into." Tank turned back to Daniel, his gaze narrowing further. "Then why'd you stay? Once you saw 3 of them, once you saw it was a fight you couldn't win, why not just run?" Daniel thought about the question seriously before answering, because it deserved a real answer. "Because if I ran," he said slowly, "she wouldn't have made it to the highway in time. Somebody had to buy the seconds. I was already there. It just made sense that it had to be me." The kitchen went quiet. Tank exhaled through his nose, some of the hardness in his posture easing, though not entirely disappearing. "All right," he said finally. "I still think we need eyes on this. Reyes doesn't just walk away from an embarrassment like that. But I'll give you this much, Carter, that's not the answer of a man looking for a handout." "I'm not looking for a handout," Daniel said. "I know," Tank said. "That's exactly why Marcus likes you already." Marcus allowed himself a small, tired smile, pouring a 3rd cup of coffee and sliding it across the counter toward Daniel. "Drink up," he said. "We've got a busy day." "Doing what?" Daniel asked. "Finding out everything we can about Victor Reyes," Marcus said, "and finding out everything we can about you." Daniel's stomach dropped slightly. "About me. Not because we don't trust you," Marcus clarified quickly, catching the flicker of alarm on Daniel's face. "Because I want to understand exactly who you were before all this. I've got a hunch there's more to your story than lost my job, lost my house. Men don't fight the way you fought last night without something underneath driving them." The investigation moved faster than Daniel expected. By early afternoon, 2 more club members had arrived at Marcus's house, a wiry man named Preacher, who ran background searches for a living under some legitimate cover job Daniel never quite understood, and a younger man called Riot who mostly stayed quiet, watching everything with sharp, careful eyes. "Found the garage where he worked," Preacher announced, laptop open on the kitchen table, Marcus and Tank leaning over his shoulders. "Desert Auto Repair closed down back in April. Owner confirms everything Carter told you, 11 years of employment, no disciplinary issues, best mechanic he ever had. Says here he tried calling around to get Carter placed somewhere else when the shop closed, but nobody was hiring." "Keep going," Marcus said. "Mother's medical records check out too," Preacher continued. "Diagnosis, treatment history, date of death, all matches exactly what he told you. Guy wasn't lying about a single detail." Daniel, standing near the doorway, felt a strange mixture of relief and violation. Listening to strangers confirm the worst parts of his life through a computer screen, his grief reduced to bullet points on a background check. "There's more," Preacher said, scrolling further. "Found records of at least 14 job applications over the last 6 months. Mechanic positions, warehouse work, even a few retail applications. Every single one came back denied." "Denied? Why?" Emily asked, who had wandered in halfway through the conversation, arms crossed, listening intently. "No permanent address," Preacher said simply. Most employers won't even consider an applicant without one. It's a trap. Can't get hired without an address, can't get an address without steady income. The kitchen went quiet again, the weight of the statement settling over the room. 14 applications, Marcus repeated slowly, his voice tight. 14 times this man tried to climb back to his feet, and 14 times the system slammed the doors shut on him for something that had nothing to do with his skill or his character. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face burning with something between shame and quiet, aching validation. Nobody had ever actually looked at the effort he'd made. To the world, he was simply a homeless man, lazy, broken, a problem to be avoided. Nobody bothered counting the applications, the interviews he'd shown up to in the cleanest clothes he owned, the rejections that piled up not because he lacked skill, but because he lacked an address on a form. "I didn't stop trying," Daniel said quietly, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "I want you all to know that. I didn't just give up." Marcus crossed the kitchen and put a heavy hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Nobody in this room thinks you gave up," Marcus said. "If anything, this proves the opposite. You kept fighting even when the whole system was built to make you stop." Tank, who had remained skeptical since the moment Daniel arrived, was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said gruffly. "This morning I looked at you like you might be trouble. Turns out you're just a man who got dealt the worst hand this city's got, and you kept getting back up anyway." "You don't owe me anything," Daniel said. "I do," Tank said firmly. "Respect's earned. You earned it twice now, once on that road, once just now." Before Daniel could respond, Preacher's laptop chimed with a notification, and his expression shifted instantly from casual to alert. "Guys," he said, "you need to see this." Everyone crowded around the screen. "Victor Reyes," Preacher said, pulling up a booking photo alongside a series of linked records. "Arrested 3 times in the last 5 years. But look at this, flagged in connection with an ongoing investigation out of Maricopa County. Human Trafficking Task Force has his name in their files." The air in the kitchen went cold. "Trafficking," Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "They haven't been able to charge him with anything yet," Preacher continued. "But he's on their radar. 2 women reported missing in the last year, both last seen in areas where Reyes was known to operate. Nothing proven, but the pattern's there." Marcus's face had gone hard as stone, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "He wasn't just some drunk looking for trouble on the highway," Marcus said slowly. "He was hunting." Daniel felt sick, the full weight of what he'd stumbled into finally crashing over him. He hadn't just interrupted a random act of violence. He had, without knowing it, potentially stopped something far worse than an assault. "If that's true," Emily said, her voice shaking now, "then last night wasn't random. He was looking for someone to take. And I just happened to be the one who broke down at the wrong time." "Which means," Tank said grimly, "Reyes isn't going to just let this go. Men like that don't walk away quietly when their plans fall apart. Especially not when they've been humiliated in front of witnesses." Marcus turned to Daniel, his expression a mixture of gratitude and dawning horror. "You didn't just save my daughter from an assault last night," he said quietly. "You may have saved her from something far worse. And that means Reyes has every reason in the world to come looking for both of you." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. "So what do we do?" Emily asked again, this time with real fear threading through her voice. Marcus looked around the room at his brothers, then back at Daniel, his jaw tightening with resolve. "We protect what's ours," he said, "starting now." The next several hours moved in a blur of activity Daniel could barely keep pace with. Club members arrived throughout the afternoon, each one briefed quickly on the situation, each one studying Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect once they heard what he'd done. Riot, the quiet young man from earlier, positioned himself near the front windows for hours, watching the street with the patient stillness of someone trained for exactly this kind of vigilance. Daniel sat at the kitchen table feeling simultaneously grateful and completely out of place, a stranger at the center of a storm he hadn't asked to create. "You don't have to look so nervous," Emily said, sitting down across from him with 2 cups of coffee, sliding one toward him. "Nobody here blames you for any of this." "Feels like I brought a hurricane into your father's house," Daniel admitted. "You brought the truth into my father's house," Emily corrected gently. "The hurricane was already out there. You just made sure it didn't reach me." Daniel wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, grateful for the warmth, grateful for a moment of quiet amid the chaos. Can I ask you something? Emily said. Sure. Last night when those men told you to walk away, were you scared? Daniel considered the question honestly before answering. Terrified, he admitted. I've never been in a real fight in my life. I knew exactly how outmatched I was. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But you didn't. No. Why? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee mug slowly in his hands. My mother used to tell me something, he said finally, that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own, but by what they choose to do when nobody's watching. I spent 8 months being told one way or another that I was worthless. No home, no job, no address, no future. And for the first time in a long time, there I was, nobody watching, nobody to prove anything to, and I had a choice. Walk away and keep being invisible, or stand there and matter, even if it was the last thing I ever did. Emily's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she didn't bother wiping them away. You could have died, she said quietly, for a stranger. You weren't a stranger by the time it mattered, Daniel said. You were just someone who needed help. That's all I saw. Before Emily could respond, Riot's voice cut sharply through the house from the front room. Marcus' car just slowed down out front. Didn't stop, but it slowed down enough to matter. The entire house shifted instantly, tension snapping tight across every face. Marcus moved to the window immediately, tank right behind him, both men scanning the street with hard, focused eyes. Plate, Marcus asked. Couldn't get it, Riot said, frustration evident in his voice. Tinted windows. Could have been nothing. Could have been Reyes doing recon, Tank said grimly, making sure he knows exactly where his humiliation is staying tonight. Daniel felt his pulse spike, old survival instincts flooding back. The same alertness that had kept him alive on the streets for 8 months, the same instinct that had saved Emily's life the night before. If he's watching this house, Daniel said slowly, then I'm putting all of you in danger just by being here. No, Marcus said, immediately turning away from the window. You're not putting us in danger. Reyes put himself in danger the moment he decided to hunt on my daughter's road. Whatever comes next, it was already coming before you ever showed up. But, Daniel, Marcus said, his voice firm, final, I didn't survive 30 years in this life by running from trouble. And I sure as hell am not about to start by throwing out the man who saved my daughter's life because some coward drove past my house too slow. Tank nodded in agreement, already pulling his phone from his pocket. I'll get eyes on the street tonight. We'll rotate watch. Nobody gets near this house without us knowing. Marcus turned back to Daniel, his expression softening slightly, despite the tension still radiating through the room. You're staying, he said simply. That's not up for discussion. Daniel swallowed hard, torn between gratitude and the aching guilt of having brought danger to people who had shown him more kindness in 24 hours than the rest of the world had shown him in 8 months. Emily reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over his. You didn't create this danger, she said quietly. You just made sure it didn't win last night. Let us make sure it doesn't win tonight either. As evening settled over the city, the mood inside Marcus's house shifted into something quieter, more watchful. Club members took turns at the windows at the door along the perimeter of the property, the casual warmth of the afternoon replaced by a tense, coiled readiness that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of the night before. Marcus found him alone in the kitchen sometime after dark, staring at nothing, his untouched coffee gone cold in front of him. You okay? Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from him. Just thinking, Daniel said, about how fast everything changed. Yesterday morning, I was just trying to figure out where I'd sleep that night. Now there's a man out there who might be connected to something a lot worse than road rage, and I'm sitting in your kitchen while your club stands guard because of a decision I made in about 4 seconds flat. You regret it? No, Daniel said, immediately surprising himself with how certain the answer came. I'd do it again. He paused, searching for the words. I don't know how to be someone people fight for. I've spent so long being someone people step around. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. You know what the funny thing about loyalty is, he said finally. It doesn't ask permission. My whole life I've built everything around one rule: you protect what's yours, and you protect anyone who proves themselves worth protecting. Last night, in about 4 seconds flat, you proved yourself twice over. Whether you know how to accept that or not doesn't change the fact that it's already true. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen slightly, some old defensive wall cracking just enough to let a sliver of warmth through. Preacher's still digging into Reyes, Marcus continued. We'll know more by morning where he's been staying, who he's connected to, whether that car tonight actually meant anything, or if Riot's just jumpy after everything that happened. And if it did mean something, Daniel asked. If he really is watching. Marcus's expression hardened the warmth from a moment ago, giving way to something colder, more resolute. Then he's about to learn exactly what happens when a man like that picks a fight with the wrong family, Marcus said. Because as of last night, Daniel Carter, whether you meant for it to happen or not, you're part of mine. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He simply nodded, the weight of the words settling over him like something solid, something real, something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the window, a car engine idled at the end of the street for exactly 11 seconds before pulling away, long enough for Riot to notice, long enough for his radio to crackle a warning through the house, long enough for every person inside to understand, without a single word being spoken, that whatever came next was only just beginning. The radio crackled again, and this time Marcus was already moving his hand, closing around Daniel's shoulder in a silent command to stay low as he crossed toward the window where Riot stood frozen, phone pressed to his ear. Talk to me, Marcus said. Same car, Riot said, his voice tight. Circled the block twice now, slowing down every time it passes the house. Plate. Still can't get it. Whoever's driving knows exactly how to stay far enough back. Tank appeared from the hallway, already pulling on his jacket, his face set in hard lines. I'll take the west side. Riot, you and Preacher cover the garage. Nobody goes near those windows without a reason. Emily had gone pale, standing near the kitchen doorway, with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and Daniel felt a fresh wave of guilt twist through him at the sight of her fear. This is because of me, Daniel said quietly, because of last night. This is because of Reyes, Marcus corrected sharply, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. You didn't put a target on this house. He did the second he decided my daughter was something he could take. The car passed one final time, its engine fading into the distance, and the house held its collective breath for a long, silent minute before Riot's voice crackled through again. Gone, for now. The tension didn't fully leave the room. Not really, it simply settled into something quieter, something that would live under the surface of every hour that followed. Marcus turned back to Daniel, his jaw tight. Get some sleep if you can, he said. Tomorrow we go on offense, instead of waiting for him to make the next move. Daniel nodded, though sleep felt like the furthest thing from possible, with his heart still hammering against his bruised ribs. He didn't know it yet, but the offense Marcus was already planning would pull him somewhere he never expected to go, back into the very life he thought he'd lost for good. Morning came gray and overcast, the kind of Phoenix morning that felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. Daniel woke to the smell of coffee again, but this time the house felt different, quieter, more purposeful, like everyone inside had shifted from reacting to planning. He found Marcus already at the kitchen table, a folder spread open in front of him, Preacher's laptop beside it displaying a photograph Daniel recognized immediately from the day before. Victor Reyes, cold eyes a scar along one cheekbone, the same face that had smiled at him on the highway right before pulling a blade. Morning, Marcus said without looking up. Sleep at all? Some, Daniel lied. Marcus glanced up, saw straight through it, and let it go without comment. Preacher found something overnight, he said instead, sliding a printed page across the table. Reyes has been renting a unit at a garage complex on the south side. Off the books, cash only registered under a name that doesn't match anything in his file, which tells us he's hiding something there he doesn't want tied back to him. Daniel scanned the page, his stomach tightening. You think that's where he's keeping... He stopped, unable to finish the thought out loud. I think it's where we need to look, Marcus said, quietly, before Reyes decides his next move is coming back here. Emily entered the kitchen mid-sentence, still in yesterday's clothes, dark circles deepening under her eyes from another sleepless night. You're not going alone, she said immediately, clearly having overheard enough from the hallway. Nobody said I was going alone, Marcus replied evenly. Good, because I want to be there. Absolutely not. Dad, Emily. Marcus's voice dropped into a tone that clearly wasn't up for negotiation, the same tone Daniel imagined had commanded rooms full of grown men for 30 years. You are not going anywhere near that man again. Not while I'm breathing. Emily's jaw tightened, frustration and fear warring across her face, but she didn't argue further. Some old practiced instinct telling her exactly where the line sat with her father. Then let me help some other way, she said instead. I still have his voice in my head. I remember details maybe nobody else caught. Marcus considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fine. You work with Preacher, cross-reference anything you remember against what we're finding. But you stay in this house. Daniel, who had been quietly watching the exchange, felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation stirring in his chest. The sensation of being trusted with something important, of being included in a plan instead of being talked around like he wasn't in the room. What about me? He asked. Marcus turned to him, studying him for a long moment. You're coming with us, Marcus said. Not into anything dangerous. I need eyes that know engines, know garages, know how to spot when something's been rigged or hidden. If Reyes has vehicles stashed there, you'll see things the rest of us might miss. Daniel nodded, something steadying inside him, at having a purpose again, at being useful in the exact way he used to be before the world decided he wasn't worth employing. I can do that, he said. Well, sure I am. The garage complex sat at the edge of an industrial stretch on the south side of Phoenix, rows of corrugated metal units baking under the gray morning light, most of them silent, a few with their doors half raised, revealing men working on cars that looked far too expensive for the neighborhood surrounding them. Marcus parked 2 blocks away, out of sight of the unit Preacher had identified, and the 3 of them, Marcus, Tank, and Daniel, approached on foot, moving with the kind of unhurried casualness that Daniel recognized as deliberate. Unit 14, Tank murmured. End of the row. The door was down, padlocked, no sign of activity. Marcus circled the perimeter slowly, his eyes scanning every detail, the dust pattern on the ground near the door, tire tracks leading in and out, a small side window covered from the inside with dark fabric. Somebody's been in and out recently, Marcus said quietly. Tracks are fresh. Daniel crouched near the tire marks, studying them with the same instinct that had once told him a client's engine was failing just by the sound. 2 different vehicles, he said, different tread patterns. One's been here a lot. See how deep this track runs compared to the lighter one, that's regular traffic. Tank glanced at him, something like surprise flickering across his face. You can tell all that from tire marks. 11 years fixing cars teaches you to read more than engines, Daniel said. Marcus knelt beside the small side window, carefully peeling back a corner of the fabric covering it, just enough to peer inside. Whatever he saw made his entire body go rigid. Marcus, Tank said. There's a car in there, Marcus said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Covered, but I can see part of the frame under the tarp. And there's... He paused, his jaw tightening. There's a mattress in the corner. Chains bolted to the wall. The air went cold around all 3 of them. We need to call this in, Daniel said immediately. Right now. This is exactly what the trafficking task force... We can't, Marcus said, standing abruptly, his voice tight with controlled fury. Not yet. If we call this in without solid proof, Reyes gets tipped off before anyone even shows up. And whatever he's planning, whoever else might already be caught up in this, disappears before police get anywhere near it. So what do we do? Tank asked. Marcus's eyes moved back to the covered car inside the unit, his expression hardening into something Daniel hadn't seen from him yet. Not the warmth from the hospital room, not the fury from the night before, but something colder, more calculated. We document everything, Marcus said. Photos, video, exactly what we're seeing. Then we take it straight to a detective. I trust someone who won't sit on it, who'll move fast enough that Reyes doesn't have time to clean this place out. Daniel felt his heart pounding, adrenaline mixing uneasily with dread. And if he comes back while we're still here? As if summoned by the question itself, the low growl of an engine turned into the far end of the lot. All 3 men froze. Move, Marcus hissed, already pulling Daniel and Tank behind the corner of the neighboring unit, pressing them flat against the metal siding. Now, through the narrow gap between buildings, Daniel watched a dark sedan roll slowly down the row of units. And even from this distance, even with only a partial view through the gap, he recognized the man stepping out of the driver's seat immediately. Victor Reyes. Daniel's pulse spiked violently, the memory of the blade grazing his forearm, flooding back with visceral physical force. Beside him, he felt Marcus go utterly still, the kind of stillness that belonged to a predator, deciding whether the moment called for patience or violence. Reyes wasn't alone. A second man climbed out of the passenger's side, and between them they hauled something. Someone from the back seat, a figure struggling. Weakly, hands bound a dark cloth bag pulled over their head. Daniel's stomach dropped through the floor. Marcus, he whispered, horror flooding through him. There's someone in that car. Marcus's face had gone the color of ash, his hands curling into white-knuckled fists. "That's not Reyes bringing supplies," Tank whispered, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "That's an active abduction happening right in front of us." For one agonizing second, nobody moved. Then Marcus's phone was already in his hand, fingers flying across the screen, and Daniel realized with a jolt of surreal clarity that this moment right now in this exact second was about to decide whether a stranger they'd never met lived or disappeared entirely. "Detective Ruiz, it's Marcus Hayes," he said, his voice dropping into a clipped, urgent whisper. "I need units to the garage complex off baseline in 7th right now. Active situation, possible abduction in progress, Unit 14. The line cut off as Marcus abruptly ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. "How long?" Tank whispered. 8 minutes minimum, Marcus said. "Maybe longer." "She won't have 8 minutes, Daniel said, watching in horror as Reyes and the second man dragged the bound figure toward the unit's side door. Marcus's eyes locked onto Daniel's, something unspoken passing between them. The same silent calculation Daniel remembered from the highway, the exact moment 2 nights ago when he decided to step between Emily and 3 armed strangers. "We can't wait 8 minutes, Marcus said quietly. "Marcus, there's 2 of them and 3 of us, but we don't know if they're armed," Tank warned. "We go in reckless. We could get that woman killed or ourselves." "And if we wait," Marcus said, "that door closes and we lose whatever chance we have." Daniel felt his heart hammering against his bruised ribs, the same terror from 2 nights ago rising up inside him, and the same certainty rising right alongside it. "I'll create a distraction," Daniel said suddenly. Both men turned to him sharply. "Absolutely not," Marcus said immediately. "I'm not asking permission," Daniel said, already moving adrenaline drowning out the pain screaming through his ribs. "I walk out into the open, make noise, draw their attention toward me instead of that door. You 2 circle around from the back." "Daniel, he already tried to kill you once." "And I'm still here," Daniel said, meeting Marcus's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "There's a woman in there who doesn't have 8 minutes. I'm not letting that happen because we were too careful to act." Before Marcus could argue further, Daniel stepped out from behind the unit, walking directly into the open lot, his voice ringing out loud and clear across the quiet industrial stretch. "Reyes." Both men at the unit door spun instantly, and Daniel watched Victor Reyes' face shift from confusion to shock to something darker as recognition landed. "You," Reyes said, his voice carrying across the distance, low and dangerous. "You've got to be kidding me." "Let her go," Daniel called out, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the way his entire body was shaking. "It's over. Cops are already on the way." Reyes' eyes narrowed, glancing quickly toward the second man beside him, some silent, violent calculation passing between them. "You've got some nerve showing your face after what you cost me," Reyes said, stepping away from the unit door, away from the bound figure moving toward Daniel, instead exactly as Daniel had hoped. "Come find out," Daniel said, backing slowly away, drawing Reyes further from the door, every step a fresh spike of adrenaline through his bruised body. From the corner of his eye, Daniel caught movement. Marcus and Tank circling wide around the back of the units, moving fast and low, closing in on the second man who remained frozen near the door, uncertain whether to follow Reyes or hold his position. "You should have stayed under whatever bridge we found you sleeping under," Reyes said, closing the distance, his hand moving toward his waistband. Daniel's blood ran cold. "He's armed." "Reyes, drop it." Marcus's voice thundered across the lot, and Reyes spun just as Marcus and Tank closed the final distance. Tank slamming into the second man before he could reach for anything, driving him hard against the metal siding of the unit. Reyes hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Daniel to close the gap between them and grab his wrist, wrenching it away from his waistband with strength he didn't know he still had left in his battered body. The 2 of them crashed to the ground together. Reyes snarling, fighting back with brutal practice force, and Daniel felt a fist connect with his already bruised ribs, white-hot pain exploding through his side. But this time, Daniel wasn't alone. Marcus reached them, seconds later, hauling Reyes off Daniel with a violence that spoke to 30 years of a life Daniel could only guess at, pinning him face down against the pavement. "Don't move!" Marcus growled, his knee planted firmly against Reyes' back. "Don't you dare move." Daniel lay on the ground for a moment, gasping pain radiating through every part of his body before forcing himself upright and stumbling toward the unit door. Inside, the bound figure had gone still, curled against the concrete floor, and Daniel's hands shook violently as he pulled the dark cloth bag away from her head. A young woman no older than 19 stared up at him with wide, terrified eyes, tears streaking down her face. "It's okay," Daniel said, his voice breaking as he worked at the ties binding her wrists. "You're safe. It's over. You're safe." The woman collapsed forward into his arms, sobbing, and Daniel held her, carefully mindful of his own injuries, whispering reassurances. He wasn't entirely sure he believed himself, yet not until he heard the distant wail of sirens finally cutting through the morning air. The next hour dissolved into chaos, police cars flooding the lot, paramedics rushing toward the young woman Daniel had pulled from that unit, officers cuffing Reyes and his accomplice, while Marcus stood off to the side, his face a mask of controlled fury as he gave his statement to a detective Daniel recognized from the phone call earlier. Daniel sat on the back of an ambulance, a paramedic checking his ribs again, wincing at the fresh bruising layered over the injuries from 2 nights before. "You've got to stop doing this to yourself," the paramedic said, only half joking. "Wasn't exactly planned," Daniel muttered. Marcus approached once his statement was finished, his expression finally softening now that the immediate danger had passed, though something heavier still lingered behind his eyes. "That woman," Marcus said quietly. "Detective says her name's Sarah. Reported missing 11 days ago. Nobody had a single lead until this morning." Daniel felt something complicated twist through his chest, relief and horror tangled together. 11 days, he repeated. "She was in there for 11 days. And she's alive," Marcus said, "because you walked out into that lot instead of staying safe behind that wall." "We all did it," Daniel said. "You and Tank. We circled around because you drew his attention first," Marcus said, cutting him off gently but firmly, the same way he had in the hospital days earlier. "Don't shrink this one either, Daniel. You did something today most men never have the courage to do even once in a lifetime. You've now done it twice in 3 days." Daniel looked away, overwhelmed, the weight of everything finally beginning to press down on him. Now that the adrenaline was draining out of his system, the fear, the pain, the horror of what he'd seen inside that unit, and underneath all of it, something quieter and more fragile trying to take root. The sense that maybe for the first time in 8 months, he wasn't invisible anymore. Detective Ruiz approached them a few minutes later, a woman in her 40s with sharp, tired eyes and a notepad tucked under one arm. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending a hand, "I understand you're the one who found her." Daniel started the old instinct to minimize rising automatically. "He drew Reyes away from the door," Marcus interjected before Daniel could finish deflecting. "Put himself directly in harm's way to give us the opening we needed." Ruiz studied Daniel for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "You understand this connects to an active federal investigation," she said. "Reyes has been on our radar for over a year. We haven't been able to make anything stick until now. What you 3 did today that gives us the physical evidence we needed. The unit, the vehicle, inside everything." "What happens to him now?" Daniel asked. "With what we found today, combined with the assault charges from 2 nights ago and the open trafficking investigation, he's not walking out of custody again anytime soon," Ruiz said. "Possibly ever." Something in Daniel's chest finally loosened a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since the moment Reyes's blade had grazed his arm on that empty highway. Ruiz turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Daniel with an expression that had shifted from professional detachment into something more personal. "For what it's worth," she said, "in this job you see a lot of people walk past danger every single day, telling themselves it's not their business. It's rare to see someone walk toward it instead. Twice." She left before Daniel could respond, and he sat there on the back of the ambulance, absorbing the words, feeling something in his chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with his bruised ribs. They drove home in silence for a while, exhaustion settling heavily over all 3 of them, the adrenaline finally fading into a bone-deep tiredness that made Daniel's eyelids feel impossibly heavy. "You scared me today," Marcus said, finally breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Walking out there like that. If Reyes had pulled that weapon a half-second faster." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I thought about that after, not before." "That's the problem with men like you," Marcus said, though there was no real anger in it, just something closer to weary affection. "You don't think about the risk until it's already behind you." "Would you have done anything different?" Daniel asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally. "I wouldn't have. but it scared me all the same. Tank sitting in the back seat let out a low chuckle. Man's been in your life 3 days and he's already giving you gray hairs, Marcus. He's been in my life 3 days, Marcus said, and he's already saved 2 lives that I know of. I'll take the gray hairs. They pulled into the driveway as the afternoon sun finally broke through the overcast sky, and Emily was already at the door before the truck had fully stopped, having clearly been watching from the window for hours. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing toward them. "Preacher wouldn't tell me anything, just that you were all okay." "We're okay," Marcus said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Reyes is in custody, for good this time." Emily's eyes found Daniel taking in the fresh bruising along his jaw, the way he moved stiffly, favoring his ribs. "What did you do?" she said, though it wasn't really a question, more a weary knowing statement, like she already understood exactly what kind of man Daniel Carter was after 3 days of watching him. "Found someone who needed help," Daniel said simply. "Same as before." Emily shook her head slowly, something between exasperation and profound gratitude passing over her face, and crossed the distance between them, pulling Daniel into a careful hug, mindful of his injuries. "You're going to give my father a heart attack one of these days," she murmured against his shoulder. "I'll try to pace myself better next time," Daniel said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he actually meant it as a joke, not a defense. That evening, as the house finally settled into something resembling calm, Marcus found Daniel alone on the back porch, staring out at the darkening desert sky. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, sitting down beside him. About what comes next for you," Marcus said. "You can't sleep in my guest room forever, and we both know you're not going back to that bridge. Not while I'm breathing." Daniel felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "Marcus, you have already done more for me than—" "I own a share in a garage," Marcus said, cutting him off. "Good friend of mine runs it. Man's been looking for a mechanic he can actually trust for months now, someone who knows engines the way you clearly do." Daniel turned to look at him, something cautious and disbelieving flickering across his face. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you an opportunity," Marcus corrected. "What you do with it is up to you. But I've watched you work a problem for 3 days, while cars dangerous situations most men would run from. I don't think there's a doubt in my mind you'd be good at it." Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the weight of the offer settling over him slowly. Disbelief warring with a fragile, dangerous hope he'd trained himself not to feel in 8 long months of closed doors. "Why are you doing all this?" Daniel asked quietly. "The house, now this. You already thanked me. You don't owe me anything more." Marcus turned to face him fully, his expression serious in a way that made Daniel sit up straighter. "Because 3 days ago," Marcus said, "a stranger with nothing left to lose looked at my daughter's fear and decided it mattered more than his own survival. That's not the kind of man you thank once and walk away from, Daniel. That's the kind of man you make sure never has to sleep under a bridge again." Daniel felt his throat tighten, tears threatening in a way he hadn't allowed himself in months. "I don't know how to accept this," he admitted. "After everything, I don't know how to just let someone help me." "You don't have to know how yet," Marcus said gently. "You just have to say yes." The porch fell quiet, the desert sky deepening into full night above them, and somewhere in that silence, Daniel Carter, mechanic, son, homeless man, twice a hero, in the space of 3 days, finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life was beginning to turn in a direction he'd stopped believing was possible. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay. Yes." Marcus smiled, the first full, unguarded smile Daniel had seen from him since the hospital room 3 nights ago, and clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "Good," Marcus said, "because tomorrow we start building the rest of your life. And I promise you, Daniel, this time, nobody's slamming the door in your face." Morning arrived with a kind of clarity Daniel hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. He stood in Marcus's driveway wearing a borrowed shirt that fit close enough, his hands trembling, slightly, not from fear this time, but from something far less familiar. Hope. "You ready?" Marcus asked, keys in hand. "No," Daniel admitted, "but let's go anyway." The garage Marcus had mentioned sat on a busy corner not far from downtown, a converted lot with 3 bays and a faded sign reading Desert Line Auto. Marcus pulled up front and killed the engine, but he didn't move to get out right away. "His name's Ray Delgado," Marcus said. "Owns the place outright. He's been a friend of the club for 20 years, not a member, just someone who's earned trust the hard way. He doesn't hire people as favors. If he keeps you on, it's because you're good, not because of me. That's fair, Daniel said, though his stomach was in knots. Inside, the smell hit Daniel first. Motor oil, rubber, hot metal, and something in his chest ached with a recognition so sharp it nearly stole his breath. It smelled like 11 years of his old life. It smelled like a version of himself he'd stopped believing still existed. A heavy-set man in his 50s emerged from beneath a raised Chevy, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes settling first on Marcus, then on Daniel, assessing him with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd been burned by bad hires before. "This the one?" Ray asked. "This is Daniel Carter," Marcus said. 11 years at Desert Auto Repair before it closed. "Heard about that place," Ray said, still studying Daniel. "Heard good things too, actually. Didn't expect the mechanic to look like he'd been through a war, though." "Long few days," Daniel said. Ray grunted, unimpressed by the deflection, and gestured toward the Chevy behind him. "Engine's been stalling intermittently. My guy's been staring at it for 2 hours and can't find the problem. You want a job, prove you can do the work. Words don't fix cars." Daniel felt the old rhythm settle into his hands before his mind even caught up the same instinct that had once made him the best diagnostic mechanic in his old shop. He crouched beside the engine, listening as Ray turned the key, letting the sound wash over him the way it always had. "Run it again," Daniel said. Ray complied. Daniel closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the subtle irregularity buried under the engine's normal hum, a stutter so faint most ears would miss it entirely. "Fuel injector," Daniel said, "third cylinder. It's not delivering consistent pressure. Probably clogged, not broken. You don't need a replacement. You need a cleaning." Ray's eyebrows rose slightly. He walked over, popped the hood fully, and inspected the injector Daniel had pointed to. A long moment passed. "Huh," Ray said, finally straightening up. "Kid's been in here 2 hours telling me it's the alternator." "It's not the alternator," Daniel said quietly. Ray looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not quite a smile, but close. "You're hired," Ray said. "Start tomorrow, 6 a.m. Marcus, standing off to the side, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod, but said nothing, letting the moment belong entirely to Daniel. "Just like that?" Daniel asked, stunned. "Just like that," Ray said. "I don't care where you slept last week, Carter. I care whether you can fix what's in front of you. You just did in 30 seconds what my other guy couldn't do in 2 hours. That's all I needed to see." For the first time in 8 months, Daniel Carter had a job. The apartment came harder. Marcus drove him to a modest complex on the edge of the cities 2 days later, a leasing office with faded carpet and a tired-looking woman behind the desk, who pulled up Daniel's information with visible hesitation the moment he mentioned he'd been without a fixed address for the better part of a year. "I'm sorry," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "Our policy requires 2 years of verifiable address history and a credit check." "I can see here that—" She paused, scanning the screen. "There's really nothing on file for the last 8 months. Daniel felt the old familiar shame creeping back in the same wall he'd hit 14 times applying for jobs before Marcus found him. "I understand," he said quietly, already turning to leave. "Wait," Marcus said, stepping forward, pulling out his wallet. "What if I co-sign the lease? I'll guarantee the rent personally. First and last month up front, plus a deposit." The woman glanced between them, clearly unused to this kind of negotiation, but the sight of Marcus's card and the very obvious weight of the cash he set on the counter softened her hesitation considerably. "I'd need to run it through my manager," she said. "But that should work." 20 minutes later, Daniel stood in an empty one-bedroom apartment, sunlight cutting through a bare window, and something inside him simply broke open. "You okay, Ma?" Marcus asked, watching him carefully. Daniel didn't answer right away. He walked slowly through the small space, a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom with nothing in it yet but sunlight and dust, and felt his knees nearly give out beneath him. "I haven't had a door that locked in 8 months, Daniel said, his voice cracking. "A door that's mine, that nobody can take from me." "It's yours," Marcus said simply. "Nobody's taking it, not while I'm around." Daniel turned to him, tears finally spilling freely down his face, no longer trying to hold them back. "I don't know how to thank you for this," Daniel said, "for any of it." "You don't thank me." Marcus said the same words he'd said in the hospital, the same words that had become something like a mantra between them. "You just live it. That's the only thanks I want." Daniel struggled more than he expected to in the weeks that followed with the strange, disorienting process of trusting kindness again. He caught himself waking at odd hours out of old habit, checking that his backpack was still beside him, even though he no longer needed to sleep with one eye open. He found himself hesitant to buy groceries with his first paycheck, some deep ingrained instinct telling him to save every dollar for the inevitable moment it would all be taken away again. Emily noticed it first. She'd taken to stopping by the garage some afternoons ostensibly to check on her father's business dealings with Ray, though everyone, Daniel included, understood it was really about checking on him. "You're doing the thing again," she said one afternoon, watching him eat a sandwich, standing up near the tool bench instead of sitting down to actually enjoy it. "What thing?" "The thing where you act like someone's going to take it away any second," she said. The apartment, all of it. You eat like you're still bracing for the ground to disappear under you." Daniel set the sandwich down, unable to argue with the accuracy of the observation. 8 months does something to you, he admitted. You stop trusting good things. You start waiting for the other shoe to drop because it always does. "It's not going to this time," Emily said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed, "but I know you spent your whole life protecting people from bad moments. My life, Sarah's life, probably 100 moments nobody will ever know about from your old life. Maybe now you should allow someone to protect you from one instead." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something in her words landing deeper than he expected. "I don't know how," he admitted quietly. "Nobody does it first," Emily said. "You just practice, same as anything else." The investigation into Victor Reyes and his crew moved forward with a speed that surprised everyone, fueled by the physical evidence recovered from the garage unit and the corroborating testimony from Sarah, the young woman Daniel had pulled free 11 days into her captivity. But 3 weeks in, Detective Ruiz called Marcus with news that soured the momentum instantly. "Reyes's attorney is trying a character angle," Ruiz explained over speakerphone, Marcus's face darkening as he listened. "They're planning to attack the credibility of your witnesses, specifically Mr. Carter's testimony from the original assault. They intend to argue that a homeless man's account can't be trusted, that his judgment might have been compromised by exhaustion, hunger, possibly substance issues." Daniel, sitting across the kitchen table, felt his stomach drop. "That's a lie," he said immediately. "I've never touched drugs in my life." "I know," Ruiz said gently. "But juries respond to narratives. Mr. Carter and defense attorneys know exactly which narratives work on people who've never experienced homelessness themselves. They're going to try painting you as unreliable. It's an ugly tactic, but it's a common one." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "They want to drag his character through the mud to save a trafficker," Marcus said, disgust thick in his voice. "That's exactly what they want to do," Ruiz confirmed. "I need you both prepared for it. It's going to get personal in that courtroom, and I need Daniel ready to hold his ground when it happens." After the call ended, the kitchen fell into heavy silence. "I can't do this," Daniel said quietly, staring at his hands. "I can't sit in a courtroom and let some lawyer tear apart everything I went through like it makes me less credible, like being homeless makes me less human." "You can," Marcus said firmly, "and you will, because Sarah needs you to, because Emily needs you to, because that man needs to go away for a very long time, and if that means sitting through some lawyer's ugly attempt to discredit you, then that's exactly what we're going to do." Daniel looked up at him, exhausted, frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger this time. "What if they win?" Daniel asked. "What if it works? What if 12 strangers decide I'm not worth believing because of where I slept 8 months ago?" Marcus reached across the table and gripped Daniel's shoulder firmly. "Then we make sure they see exactly who you are," Marcus said. "Not the man who slept under a bridge, the man who stepped between 3 armed strangers and my daughter. The man who walked into danger a second time to save a girl he'd never met. That's who's walking into that courtroom. Nobody's taking that away from you." The trial began on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, the courtroom filled with a strange mixture of faces, reporters who'd caught wind of the trafficking angle, a handful of Hell's Angels members sitting quietly in the back rows in a show of solidarity that made the bailiffs visibly nervous, and Sarah's family seated together, gripping each other's hands. Daniel sat outside the courtroom before his testimony, his hand shaking, Emily seated beside him. "You don't have to be perfect in there," she said quietly. "You just have to tell the truth. That's all any of this has ever needed from you. What if the truth isn't enough? It was enough to save my life, Emily said. It was enough to save Sarah's life. It'll be enough in there, too. When his name was called, Daniel walked into the courtroom with his shoulders straighter than he'd carried them in months, taking the stand under the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes. The prosecutor walked him through the events of that night methodically. The sound of the failing engine, the three men, the confrontation, the injuries he'd sustained protecting Emily. Daniel answered each question steadily, his voice growing stronger, with every sentence, the fear slowly giving way to something firmer underneath it. Then the defense attorney rose and Daniel felt the temperature in the room shift. Mr. Carter, the attorney began, his tone deceptively pleasant. At the time of this alleged incident, you'd been living without permanent housing for approximately 8 months. Is that correct? That's correct, Daniel said evenly. During that time, would you say your judgment was clear, reliable? I've never used drugs, if that's what you're implying, Daniel said before the prosecutor could object, his voice steady despite the anger flickering beneath it. I was hungry. I was tired. I was grieving my mother and trying to survive in a system that slammed doors in my face 14 times when I applied for honest work. None of that made me unreliable. It made me human. A murmur passed through the courtroom. The attorney pressed on, undeterred. Isn't it possible in your exhausted, malnourished state that you misjudged the severity of the situation? Perhaps escalated a confrontation that could have been avoided entirely. 3 men surrounded a young woman alone on an empty highway at night, Daniel said, his voice hardening. Now the fear completely burned away. One of them pulled a knife on me. That's not something I misjudged. That's something I lived through with the scars to prove it. He pulled back his sleeve, slightly revealing the still healing line across his forearm, and the courtroom fell utterly silent. The attorney, visibly rattled, shifted tactics. Mr. Carter, isn't it true that men in your circumstances sometimes seek out dangerous situations, perhaps looking for purpose, for validation? Objection, the prosecutor said sharply. Argumentative and frankly offensive, Your Honor. Sustain, the judge said firmly. Counsel, move on or wrap up. The attorney hesitated clearly, having lost whatever ground he'd hoped to gain, and Daniel watched something shift across the jury's faces. Not pity, but something closer to respect. No further questions, the attorney said, finally retreating to his table. As Daniel stepped down from the stand, he caught Marcus's eyes in the gallery, and the older man gave him a small, proud nod that meant more to Daniel than he could have put into words. Sarah testified 2 days later, her account of 11 days in captivity, leaving the courtroom in stunned, heavy silence. When she described the moment Daniel had pulled the bag from her head, her voice broke in marredly. I thought I was going to die in that room, she said through tears. And then this stranger, this man I'd never met, was kneeling in front of me, telling me I was safe. I didn't even know his name yet. I just knew for the first time in 11 days that someone actually saw me. Daniel, seated in the gallery beside Marcus, felt his own eyes burn, the weight of everything finally settling into something he could almost call peace. The verdict came 4 days later. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, human trafficking, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy. The judge's sentencing left no ambiguity about how seriously the court viewed what Reyes and his associates had done decades behind bars, with no possibility of early release for the trafficking charges. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's mother approached Daniel, pulling him into an embrace before he could even react. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking. You gave me my daughter back. There's no way I can ever repay that. You don't have to, Daniel said, echoing words that had become almost sacred to him over the last month. Just seeing her safe is enough. Marcus stood nearby, watching the exchange with an expression of quiet, profound pride, and when Daniel finally turned to him, Marcus simply pulled him into a firm embrace. You did that, Marcus said. Every bit of it. That courtroom, that verdict that happened because you refused to stay quiet, even when it would have been easier. I had help, Daniel said. A lot of it. Maybe, Marcus said, but the courage was all yours. Diga. Life in the weeks that followed began to settle into something Daniel had almost forgotten was possible: a rhythm. Mornings at the garage, hands deep in engines, the satisfaction of fixing what others had given up on returning to him fully, now undiminished by everything he'd survived. Evenings in his own apartment, a door that locked a bed that was his. Ray, watching him work one afternoon, finally broke the comfortable silence between them. "You're the best mechanic I've had in 15 years, Ray said. "Figured you should know that." "Appreciate that," Daniel said, not looking up from the engine in front of him. "I mean it," Ray pressed. "Customers are asking for you by name now. You've got an instinct for this. Most guys spend a decade trying to develop and never quite get there." Daniel allowed himself a small smile, something that would have felt impossible 8 months earlier. "My mother used to say I had ears like a doctor," he said, "except doctors charge more." Ray laughed, a genuine warm sound. "Well, doctor, keep doing what you're doing. This place is better with you in it." That evening, Emily stopped by his apartment unannounced, holding a small potted plant she set awkwardly on his mostly bare kitchen counter. "Figured the place could use something alive in it," she said. "Besides you, obviously." Daniel laughed genuinely, the sound still slightly unfamiliar in his own ears after so long, without much reason to use it. "Thank you," he said, "for this. For everything, honestly. I don't think I've said that enough." "You've said it plenty," Emily said, settling onto one of the two mismatched chairs in his small kitchen. "I think the truth is you don't fully believe you deserve any of it yet." Daniel didn't answer right away because she wasn't wrong. "It's strange," he admitted finally. 3 months ago, I was invisible. Nobody looked at me twice. Now I've got a giant apartment, people who actually—" He paused, searching for the word. "People who actually see me. It doesn't feel real yet. Some mornings I wake up and brace myself for it to have all been a dream." "It's real," Emily said gently. "You earned every piece of it. Not because you saved me or saved Sarah, though God knows that's part of it. You earned it because of who you've been every single day since. Showing up, working hard, being honest even when the whole courtroom was trying to tear you down." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. "You know," he said slowly, "you've become a pretty important part of all this. Not just because your father gave me a chance, because of you specifically." Emily's cheeks flushed slightly, though she held his gaze steadily. "I was going to say the same thing about you." The moment lingered comfortable and warm before Emily cleared her throat and stood breaking the silence with a small, self-conscious laugh. "I should get going. Dad wants me home before dark. Some habits from 30 years in this life die hard." "Tell him I said thank you," Daniel said. "Again." "He knows," Emily said, pausing at the door, "but I'll tell him anyway. He likes hearing it even if he pretends he doesn't." After she left, Daniel stood in his small kitchen for a long time staring at the plant she'd left behind, something small and green and alive, in a space that had been empty just weeks before. He thought about his mother, about the words she'd given him as a boy, that he'd carried through 11 years of honest work, 8 months of unimaginable hardship, and finally into whatever new chapter was beginning now. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, but by what they choose to do when nobody's watching. Nobody had been watching on that empty highway 3 months ago. Nobody had been watching in that garage unit when he'd walked directly toward a man who'd already tried to kill him once. But somewhere along the way, without ever meaning to, Daniel Carter had become the kind of man other people watched, not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but out of genuine hard-earned respect. He didn't know yet how far that respect would carry him, how much more his life was still about to change in the months ahead. He only knew, standing in his own kitchen with a door that locked and a job waiting for him in the morning, that for the first time since his mother's hand had gone still in his, he finally believed things might actually be okay. 6 weeks passed before the trouble found them again. Daniel had settled into a rhythm he still sometimes couldn't believe belonged to him, waking before dawn in his own apartment, walking the 4 blocks to Desert Line Auto, with coffee in hand, spending his days elbow deep in engines that trusted him the way people once hadn't. Ray had started handing him the difficult jobs, first one, the ones other mechanics avoided, and Daniel took each one like a gift instead of a burden. Then on a Thursday evening in late spring, Tank showed up at his apartment door, his face grim in a way that made Daniel's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. "We've got a problem," Tank said. "What kind of problem?" Ray has had associates, guys who weren't at the garage that morning, guys who never got charged with anything because we couldn't tie them to it directly. Preacher's been keeping tabs since the trial ended just in case. Word came back tonight that 2 of them have been asking around about you. Where you live, where you work. Daniel felt the old cold spread through his chest, the same sensation from the night on the highway when 3 men's headlights had swept across the road. Asking around why, Daniel asked, though some part of him already knew. Revenge, Tank said flatly. Reyes is gone for the rest of his life, thanks to you and Sarah's testimony. These guys lost their whole operation because of what happened at that garage unit. In their world, that's not something you let go unanswered. Daniel sat down heavily on the arm of his couch, the fragile piece of the last 6 weeks suddenly feeling as thin as glass. Does Marcus know? He's the one who sent me, Tank said. He wants you at the house tonight, not a suggestion. Marcus's kitchen looked exactly like it had on that first chaotic morning weeks earlier. Except this time the tension in the room felt different. Not the raw panic of an active threat, but something colder, more calculated, the kind of danger that crept instead of charged. 2 men, Marcus said, spreading a folder open on the table mugshots Preacher had pulled from old arrest records. Julian Cross and a man who goes by Diesel, real name's Aaron Boone. Both ran with Reyes for years before he ever crossed paths with Emily. Neither one caught a charge from the trial because the evidence tied specifically to Reyes and the 2 men arrested at the unit. So they're free, Daniel said. And they blame me. They blame all of us, Emily said quietly from where she stood near the counter, arms crossed tightly over her chest, old fear resurfacing in her eyes that Daniel hated seeing return after weeks of watching it fade. Reyes was the one running the operation, but we're the reason it ended. That makes us all targets in their eyes. We've had eyes on both of them since Preacher flagged this, Marcus said. Cross has been staying at a motel off the interstate. Boone's harder to track, moves around a lot, stays with different people. What do we do? Daniel asked the question, feeling painfully familiar. A mirror of the same conversation months earlier that had ended with a garage unit, a covered car, and a young woman chained to a wall. This time, Marcus said firmly, we don't wait for them to make the first move. We go to Ruiz. We hand her everything Preacher's found. We let the system handle this before it turns into something none of us can walk back from. Daniel felt something in him relax slightly at that, the promise of caution, this time of trusting the process instead of running headlong into danger the way he had twice before. But 2 nights later, that promise shattered. Daniel woke to the smell of smoke. For a groggy, disoriented second, he thought he was dreaming some old nightmare from his months on the street resurfacing. Then the smoke detector screamed to life, and Daniel bolted upright, his heart slamming against his ribs as he registered the acrid smell, growing thicker, the faint orange glow flickering beneath his apartment door. No, he gasped, scrambling out of bed. No, no, no. He grabbed his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands as he pressed the back of his palm against the door cool, not yet dangerously hot, and yanked it open to find the hallway thick with smoke pouring from the direction of the stairwell. Fire! Daniel shouted, pounding on his neighbor's doors as he moved, adrenaline overriding the panic clawing at his throat. Everybody out now! Fire! Doors flew open around him. Disoriented tenants stumbling into the smoke-filled hallway, and Daniel found himself doing what he'd done twice before without a second thought, pushing toward the danger. Instead of away from it, guiding an elderly woman from apartment 4B toward the emergency exit at the far end of the hall, one arm wrapped around her trembling shoulders. This way, ma'am. I've got you. Keep moving. By the time fire crews arrived, the blaze had gutted the stairwell and 2 units, though thankfully, miraculously, everyone had made it out alive, coughing, shaken, standing in the parking lot wrapped in blankets as flashing lights painted the night in urgent red and blue. Marcus arrived within 20 minutes, having received Tank's call the moment word reached him, his face a mask of barely restrained fury as he found Daniel sitting on the curb, soot streaked across his face, an oxygen mask hanging loosely around his neck, where a paramedic had left it after checking his lungs. You're okay? Marcus demanded, kneeling in front of him. I'm okay, Daniel said, his voice raw from smoke. Everyone got out. This wasn't an accident, Marcus said, his jaw tight. Fire investigators already saying it started near the stairwell, multiple points of origin. That's not faulty wiring, Daniel. That's arson. Daniel felt something cold settle deep in his stomach, the full weight of what had almost happened crashing over him all at once. They tried to kill me, he said quietly, in my sleep, in my own home. They tried, Marcus said, his voice hardening into something dangerous. And they failed. But this ends the danger of being cautious. We're done waiting for the system to catch up. Detective Ruiz met them at the hospital an hour later, her expression grim as she reviewed the preliminary fire report on her tablet. Accelerant traces near the stairwell, she confirmed. This was deliberate. Given everything we already know about Cross and Boone, I don't think this is a coincidence. Then arrest them, Marcus said, his patience visibly fraying. I need probable cause that holds up in court, Ruiz said. Suspicion isn't enough, but I promise you this changes the priority level on our end significantly. We're pulling surveillance from every camera within a mile of that apartment complex tonight. Daniel sat in a hospital chair, exhausted, the oxygen mask now discarded. Staring at his hands that had once fixed engines, other mechanics gave up on hands that had pulled Sarah free from captivity, hands that had, an hour earlier, guided a terrified elderly woman through smoke thick enough to kill. I keep thinking, Daniel said quietly, mostly to himself, that every time I finally feel safe, something happens to remind me I'm not. Emily, who had rushed to the hospital the moment she heard, sat down beside him, taking his soot-streaked hand in both of hers without hesitation. You are safe, she said firmly. This doesn't undo any of that. It just means we have more work to do before it's completely over. What if it's never completely over? Daniel asked, something raw and exhausted bleeding into his voice. What if I spend the rest of my life waiting for the next fire, the next highway, the next man with a knife? Emily was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then you'll face it, she said finally, the same way you faced everything else. Not because you're fearless, I don't think you've ever been fearless a day in your life, but because you keep choosing to stand anyway. That's not going to stop being true just because things get hard again. Daniel looked at her, something in her steady, unwavering gaze, anchoring him in a way he desperately needed in that moment. You really believe that? He asked. I've watched you prove it 3 times now, Emily said. I don't just believe it, I know it. The break came 4 days later, and it came from the last place anyone expected. Preacher monitoring the security footage Ruiz had pulled from a gas station a half-mile from Daniel's apartment complex spotted something that made his blood run cold. Julian Cross's car, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m., the night of the fire, less than 20 minutes before the first flames were reported. But it wasn't just the car that mattered. There's a second person in the passenger seat, Preacher said, pulling Marcus and Ruiz over to his laptop, zooming in on the grainy footage. Look at this. The image sharpened slightly, and Daniel, standing behind them, felt the floor drop out from under him. That's not Boone, Ruiz said slowly, studying the face. No, Preacher agreed. It's not. He pulled up a comparison photo, and the room went utterly silent. That's Detective Alvarez, Preacher said. Narcotics Division. Ruiz, isn't he the one who... He handled evidence intake on the original Reyes case, Ruiz said, her voice suddenly tight with fury and disbelief. He had access to everything. Chain of custody logs, witness addresses, all of it. The implications crashed over the room like a physical weight. Someone inside the department, Marcus said slowly, helped them find where Daniel lived. This changes everything, Ruiz said, already pulling out her phone. If Alvarez was compromised, we need to know how deep this goes. This isn't just Cross and Boone acting alone anymore. This is someone with access to protected information, helping men we already knew were dangerous find their targets. Daniel felt sick, the ground shifting beneath everything he'd believed about his own safety over the last several weeks. How many other people know where I live because of him? Daniel asked quietly. Emily, Sarah, everyone who testified. We're pulling all of it, Ruiz said, already moving toward the door. Every address, every protected witness detail Alvarez had access to. If he's been selling information, we need to know exactly how far this reaches right now. The following 72 hours moved in a blur of arrests, internal affairs investigations, and mounting revelations that painted a picture far darker than anyone had initially understood. Alvarez, once cornered with the security footage and financial records showing unexplained cash deposits traced back to an account linked to Reyes's remaining associates, cracked within hours of questioning. He gave up Cross and Boone within the first interview, Ruiz told Marcus and Daniel 2 days later, sitting across from them in the same kitchen where this entire second nightmare had begun. Both men are in custody now. Cross is already talking, trying to cut a deal, blaming everything on Boone and claiming Alvarez set the whole thing up. And Alvarez, Marcus asked, facing obstruction charges. Evidence tampering accessory to attempted murder, given what happened at Daniel's apartment, Ruiz said. His career is over. Likely his freedom too. Daniel sat quietly, absorbing the news. The relief tangled tightly with something heavier. The unsettling realization of just how close he'd come to losing everything he'd rebuilt, all because of one corrupted man inside a system meant to protect people, had decided a payoff mattered more than the lives it endangered. "It's over," Emily said softly, reaching for his hand. "Really over this time." "Is it?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "Every time I think it's over, something else comes." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "Daniel, listen to me. What you went through this week, that wasn't a reflection of anything you did wrong. That was the last desperate gasp of men who lost everything because you had the courage to stand up when it mattered. This isn't a pattern that's going to keep repeating. This was the end of it, the very last of it." Daniel wanted desperately to believe him. "I know it's hard to trust that," Marcus continued, seeing the doubt still lingering behind Daniel's eyes. "After everything the world's taken from you, I understand exactly why safety feels like something you can't quite hold on to yet. But you've spent the last 2 months proving over and over that you're not the same man who was sleeping under that bridge. That man is gone, Daniel. He's not coming back. And neither is the danger that almost took your life this week." Daniel exhaled slowly, something in his chest finally beginning to loosen after days of holding his breath. "Okay, Ashjan," he said quietly. "Okay, I believe you." With Crossboone and Alvarez all in custody, and the threat finally definitively neutralized, life began to settle again. Though this time Daniel noticed it settled with a kind of permanence the earlier weeks hadn't carried. Ray offered him something entirely unexpected on a slow Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks later, wiping grease from his hands as he leaned against the workbench where Daniel was finishing a transmission repair. "I've been thinking," Ray said, "about retirement, about what happens to this place when I'm ready to stop." Daniel looked up, uncertain where this was headed. "You're not old enough to be talking retirement, Ray." "I'm old enough to know I don't want to run this place forever," Ray said. "And I've been watching you for 2 months now. Customers ask for you by name. You've got instincts I haven't seen in a mechanic in 15 years. I want to offer you a partnership. Real ownership stake, not just a paycheck." Daniel set down his wrench, slowly stunned into silence. "Ray, I don't have anywhere near the capital to buy into a business." "I'm not asking for capital," Ray said. "I'm asking for sweat, equity, and time. You put in the work, prove yourself over the next year, the way you already have the last 2 months, and we draw up papers making you an equal partner. Eventually, if you want it full owner, when I finally do step back." Daniel felt something overwhelming rise in his throat, gratitude so large it nearly stole his breath entirely. "Why me?" he asked. "You could offer this to anyone." "Because you're not just good with engines," Ray said. "You treat every customer like their problem matters even when it's something small. You never once complained about pulling extra shifts these last 2 months, even after everything you went through. That's not something I can teach a person. Either they've got it or they don't. You've got it." That evening, Daniel told Marcus and Emily the news over dinner at Marcus's house, the same kitchen table where his entire new life had first begun taking shape. "Partner," Marcus repeated, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. "Daniel Carter, business owner. Never thought I'd see the day a man I found bleeding on my hospital room floor would end up running his own shop inside of 3 months. It's not mine yet," Daniel said, though he couldn't fully suppress his own smile. "There's a year of proving myself first." "You've been proving yourself since the moment you stepped onto that highway," Emily said. "This is just the world finally catching up to what we already knew." But it was 2 weeks later, on an ordinary Saturday morning, that Daniel encountered something that would close the final circle of his own story in a way he never expected. He was driving to the garage, early coffee in hand, when he spotted a familiar shape huddled beneath the same overpass where he himself had slept for 8 long months. Daniel slowed the truck. Marcus had helped him finance something tightening in his chest, and at the sight, not fear this time, not the old instinct to look away, but recognition. He knew that particular hunch of shoulders. He knew that specific exhausted stillness. Daniel pulled over and got out. "Frank," he called out. The man startled, lifting his head, slowly squinting against the morning light, and Daniel felt his heart clench at the sight of an old face from his months on the street, a fellow drifter he'd shared conversation and the occasional meal with during the worst stretch of his own life, back when they'd both been invisible together beneath that same bridge. "Daniel," Frank said, disbelief washing over his weathered features. "That's you, man. You look." He paused, taking in Daniel's clean clothes, the truck parked nearby, the healthy weight that had returned to his frame. "You look like you got out." "I did," Daniel said quietly, crouching down to Frank's level, refusing to let the distance between them feel like anything other than two men talking. "Things changed for me a couple months back." "Good for you, man," Frank said, and Daniel heard no bitterness in it, only genuine weary happiness for someone he'd once considered a friend in the loneliest chapter of both their lives. "Real good for you." Daniel studied him for a long moment, at an idea forming with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. "You still know your way around an engine?" Daniel asked. "Seemed to remember you mentioning you used to work construction, ran equipment maintenance." 15 years, Frank said, surprised by the question. "Why, because I've got a friend who owns a garage," Daniel said, "and I think he might be looking for another set of hands, someone reliable, someone who knows machines." Frank's expression shifted slowly from confusion to disbelieving hope, the exact transformation Daniel remembered feeling himself in Marcus's kitchen months earlier. "You serious?" Frank asked. "Dead serious," Daniel said. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. I'll introduce you myself." As they drove toward the garage together, Frank staring out the window at a city that had ignored him for months, Daniel felt something settle fully into place inside himself, the understanding that his mother's words had never just been about the moment on that highway with Emily. They'd been about every moment since, every choice to help, every decision to see someone the world had decided to look past. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, but by what they choose to do when nobody is watching. Somebody had been watching Daniel once on an empty road at night, and because they had everything after had become possible, now it was Daniel's turn to watch for the next person the world had stopped seeing. Ray hired Frank on the spot after a 20-minute test the same way he'd hired Daniel months earlier. And by the end of that week, Frank had a small room rented above a friend's garage, the first real roof over his head in over a year. 6 months after the night Daniel first heard a motorcycle engine die on an empty highway, Desert Line Auto held a celebration that spilled out onto the lot. String lights hung between the bay doors, a folding table loaded with food. Emily and Marcus had spent the morning preparing half the local Hells Angels, chapter mingling easily with customers and neighbors who'd come to know Daniel over the last half year. The occasion was simple but monumental. The official signing of Daniel's partnership papers, the culmination of 6 months of relentless, honest work. Ray stood on an overturned crate, raising a bottle of soda since half the crowd didn't drink, clearing his throat for attention. "Most of you know Daniel's story by now," Ray said, his voice carrying easily across the lot. "Some version of it, anyway. What you might not know is that in 6 months, this man has turned around 3 engines I'd already written off as scrap, trained up a second mechanic who's turning out to be just as sharp as he is, and never once, not one single time, complained about where he came from or what it took to get here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. "So it's my honor," Ray continued, "to officially welcome Daniel Carter as full partner and co-owner of Desert Line Auto." The crowd erupted into applause, and Daniel, standing beside Ray with the partnership papers already signed and filed, felt his throat tighten with an emotion too large to fully contain. Marcus stepped forward once the applause quieted, his expression serious in the way it became whenever he had something important to say. "I want to say something too," Marcus announced, and the lot fell into respectful silence, the weight of his presence commanding attention the way it always did. 6 months ago, my daughter's motorcycle broke down on an empty road outside this city. 3 dangerous men found her before help could, and the only person who stopped to protect her was a man most of this city had trained itself not to see. Marcus's eyes found Daniel's across the crowd, and something passed between them that needed no further words. "People think heroes are born with power," Marcus continued, his voice steady and clear. "Money, status, some kind of natural advantage the rest of us don't have. They're wrong. Heroes are ordinary people who choose to stand when everyone else walks away. Daniel Carter had nothing the night he saved my daughter's life. No home, no money, no reason at all to risk what little he had left. And he stood anyway." The crowd had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on Marcus, on Daniel, and the weight of everything the moment carried. "Since that night," Marcus went on, "this man has saved a second life, pulling a trafficking victim out of captivity. He survived an arson attack meant to silence him. He stood in a courtroom and let strangers try to tear apart his character, and he did it without ever once backing down from the truth. And through all of it, he's spent every single day proving that where you sleep or what you own has absolutely nothing to do with who you are. Marcus raised his own soda bottle high. To Daniel Carter, he said, the man this city looked past for 8 months and the man none of us will ever be able to look past again. The crowd raised their drinks voices, rising together in agreement, and Daniel stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed tears finally slipping free that he made no attempt to hide. Emily appeared beside him as the celebration settled back into easy conversation, slipping her hand into his without hesitation, the gesture no longer carrying any uncertainty between them, after months of slowly, carefully building toward exactly this. You okay? She asked softly. Better than okay. Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't think I have the words for what this feels like. You don't need words, Emily said. You just need to keep living it. Same thing my dad's been telling you since the beginning. Daniel looked out over the celebration. Frank laughing with another mechanic near the tool bench. Ray deep in conversation with Tanky about an old motorcycle restoration project. Sarah and her mother who had come specifically to celebrate this milestone in the life of the man who'd saved her, Marcus, watching over all of it, with the quiet, satisfied pride of a man who understood exactly what he'd helped build. 8 months ago, Daniel said quietly, mostly to himself, I didn't think I had anything left to offer anyone. I thought I was finished, invisible, forgotten. And now, Emily asked. Daniel turned to look at her, at the life surrounding him that had once felt entirely impossible, and felt something settle deep and permanent inside his chest. Not fragile hope this time, but solid, unshakable certainty. Now I know that wasn't true, he said. It was never true. I was just waiting for someone to see what was still there underneath everything I'd lost. Emily smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as the desert sun began its slow descent behind them, painting the sky in warm, brilliant color over the small garage that had become, against every possible odd, the center of an entirely new life. Daniel Carter had spent 8 months as a man nobody bothered to see stepped around, judged, dismissed, erased by a city that decided his worth ended the moment he lost his home. But on one ordinary night on an empty highway, he had made a choice that no amount of hardship had managed to take from him. The choice to stand when standing cost him everything he had left to lose. That single decision had not only saved a young woman's life, it had saved a trafficking victim 11 days into her captivity. It had exposed corruption inside a system meant to protect the very people it had failed. And in the end, it had given a broken, forgotten man back the one thing the world had convinced him he'd lost. Forever his own worth proven, not through what he owned, but through everything he chose to do when he believed nobody was watching at all. The man the city once looked straight through had become the man an entire community now looked to. And nothing, not fire, not fear, not every closed door that had ever slammed in his face, would ever make him invisible again.